All right, I'll get started. You guys hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I know it's a hard time of year to get folks together with the holidays coming up, so appreciate you making the effort. We're going to go over a little background first for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, Temecula Creek, in case you kind of forgot. I know it's been a little bit of time. So we'll start with introductions. It's a small enough group. I'll start. I'm Angela Chongpinich. I'm the project manager. I'm with SWCA Environmental Consultants. And pass to Mark.
I'm Mark. I'm working project manager on the city side of this. So.
We'll just go around the room.
Okay, Matt, just a guy.
Terry being kind of QRC.
Bob O'Brien, SDSU.
Katie Garcia with planning.
Matt Peters, Assistant Director of Community Development.
Mike Elford, I'm the City Emergency Manager.
Tom Green, Marshall Walker.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. All right, so again, I'll just go over some background refresher, key elements, what is a CWPP. I'm going to go over an AGOL map. It's an ArcGIS online map. It's the basis of the story map that we'll be providing with this project. So an interactive, user-friendly version of the written document CWPP. We'll go over the management approach and then have time for questions at the end. All right, so here's the quick refresher. What is a CWPP? The goal is to have a plan in place that reduces threats to life and property from wildfire. It stems from the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. The key elements, it should be collaborative. It should identify and prioritize hazardous fuels treatments on the landscape and methods to protect at-risk communities. And that includes things like structural ignitability and defensible space. It does not mandate actions. However, as you guys know, having a CWPP in place makes you eligible for certain types of grants. That could be federal, like FEMA and Forest Service, or it could be state level, like some of the CAL FIRE items. The recommendations are divided up by categories. That's resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, safe, effective, risk-based wildfire response. And then we like to add in post-fire recovery, since as we know, fire is part of the landscape in this state and is not going away anytime soon. So resilient landscapes, this is really where you see the fuels treatments recommendations. It's how can you increase ecosystem health and resilience, and how can we even restore, say, an ecosystem that's been impacted by a catastrophic wildfire or other, past anthropogenic activities that may have degraded the system. Fire-adapted communities, this includes things like public education and outreach, having fire-wise communities, having programs for defensible space measures, etc. And then structural ignitability, helping homeowners and property owners understand what they can do. And then fire response, most of the time we look at this from the viewpoint of the property and homeowner. What can you do to help the fire response if there is an emergency? So what measures can you do on your parcel that will make it easier? Say when there's an evacuation or emergency responders are trying to identify different parcels or have ingress and egress in gated communities. Okay, so moving on to the project overview refresher. This is for the Temecula Creek site, and that's the smaller red boundary there. Then the dashed line is the half-mile buffer, which is the treatment influence zone. So that ties into the CAL FIRE language for the grant for this. Of course, we have the WUI areas, the wild urban interface areas, directly adjacent to the creek bed. And as you guys know, there's substantial cultural, biological, and ecological values in this whole area. So the goal of this project is to develop a holistic, comprehensive approach that takes into account not just the wildfire part, but those other values, the cultural, the biological, et cetera. All right, so role and schedule, we have city staff, we have the development team, and we have the public. So this meeting was really focusing on folks on the development team. We're gonna have 3 benchmark meetings to have your input, to give you updates, and review documents. Today is meeting number 1. So going to go over some of our preliminary results from our field surveys and our wildfire modeling. The second meeting will be early next spring. And that's when we'll have a draft CWPP and process dependencies ready to present to you, as well as that interactive story map, which I said is the user-friendly version if you don't want to read a document. And then the third meeting will be later in the summer next year when we have the final documents ready. All right, so I'm gonna go over the resource areas that this project is focusing on. First and foremost, we have fuels and wildfire. So back in the spring, we had crews do site visits down in the creek. Thank you, Mark, and others who helped them gain access and give some local knowledge. So they verified vegetation, they did botany surveys, and that directly plays into deciding what fuel models are out there. So fuel models is just the fire version of looking at vegetation on the landscape in the lens of what would carry fire if there were to be a fire on the landscape. So we use that to make sure that our modeling basis, the fuel models, was accurate based on what's actually on the ground, because everything comes from satellite imagery, which only gets updated once a year. So, things change pretty quickly. Then we modeled the fire behavior with those current ground truth conditions using key metrics, and we'll go over some of those. And then we ran a risk assessment, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. For natural resources, like I already mentioned, we did a botany survey, we did a wildlife survey, and we did a wetlands riparian survey as well. There was, of course, critical habitat that was confirmed out there, including Least Bells Vireo and prime riparian areas. For cultural resources, they did do a record search. As again, you probably already know, there were a lot of culturally important sites that did come up, not only within that half-mile treatment influence zone, but also in the greater region. All right, so this is, if you guys have never seen one, this is an ArcGIS online map. So I'm gonna go over some of the data here. So here is our project, and then that's that half-mile treatment influence zone. Okay, so we're gonna look at the fire behavior items first. So like I mentioned, fuel models is basically what carries fire in terms of vegetation. So I know this doesn't mean much to you when you're not familiar with it, but if you look at it, it's about 50% gray, and all that gray is non-burnable. So that's either going to be developed, like housing, roadways, sidewalks, concrete in water spillways, or it's going to be bare soil where there's literally, no fuel that could carry a wildfire out there. The other half of our project area, as you can see, is a mixture of browns and yellows. So the predominant vegetation out there that would carry fire is a combination of grasses and shrubs. All right, so we use that to run our fire behavior modeling, and we're going to go over a few of the items that we looked at. So the first one is burn probability, and it is what it sounds like. It's what's the likelihood that if you had an ignition source, there would be a fire on the landscape. And this takes into account not only those conditions, those fuel models, but also historic fire in the area. So it takes into account how many fires have happened in this same landscape, looks at the pixel, and also weather. Weather comes from a RAWS, a remote area weather station, and that is a live continuous feed 24 hours a day unless it's offline. So it's very accurate in what the conditions are at all times. So if you look at this, the burn probability, red, orange, means a higher likelihood over in the western portion, and then a lot lower on the eastern portion. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is no history of fire within the creek bed, at least not that has been reported. Not to say it hasn't happened. Okay, so the next one we're gonna look at is flame length. And it's the same kind of measure. Fire is typically, if it's orange red, it's worse, or it's more extreme. So you can see here that the modeled flame length is predominantly 4 to 8 feet. So that is pretty high. And a lot of that is coming from overgrown shrubs and a lot of ladder fuels, which are the fuels that connect the surface to the canopy fuels. Okay, this is rate of spread, which is exactly what it sounds like, how fast the fire would move if there were to be a fire on the landscape. So most of this is 20 to 50 chains per hour. A chain is a land management measurement. It's about 66 feet. So 20 to 50 chains per hour is actually a little fast for grass. Typically in grass you see 0 to 20 is ideal. So you can see that if there were to be a fire, it would move pretty quickly in there. And this is coming from conditions in the spring. So typically, when there is green up. So it could be worse than this in the summertime when it's drier. So to put these together, we have a measurement called integrated hazard. And so this combines your flame length, your fire history, basically what kind of fire and the likelihood of fire, and it comes out with one comprehensive metric. So the integrated hazard here shows that the higher hazard would be on the western portion, west of I-15, and less hazard on the eastern portion. One disclaimer for fire modeling, it only looks at surface fuels, which is why it's really difficult sometimes to capture what can be expected on the landscape when you have a lot of ladder fuels or something like wind forces the fire up into the canopies. So that is definitely a weak point in the modeling platforms out there right now. So the eastern portion, it's showing it as a lower hazard, but I definitely see it in terms of a fire as being equal to that western portion of the project. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next resource. All right, like I mentioned, we had several surveys out there. So we have pictures as well connected to these. But this is from Waters, and you can just see that they were documenting what site conditions were. So they have observed flow lines and the riparian areas. They're really small, but they're nested over here on the western portion. So again, this satellite imagery is misleading. It's coming from Google Earth. It looks like there's nothing there, but in fact, our biologists confirm that there's really good habitat out there. Okay, for wildlife, they just marked some key points, and like I said, that's where they, from baseline surveys, heard least bells vireo calls. There were not species-specific surveys conducted, however, so they can't pinpoint exact locations. So that's where these markers are coming from. And also spadefoot toad is another one that they discovered out there. And then just looking at general vegetation. So again, they marked some special status plants. Those are mostly over here in the eastern portion. And then just general vegetation type. There we go, that's what I was looking for. And this correlates to the map that you guys have a printout, so it's, larger vegetation type. And then of course we have the cultural resources data. It is sensitive, so I'm not gonna share it, but within, like I said, within this half-mile buffer, there were quite a few sites that showed up. All right, so I had mentioned that we did a risk assessment, and what is a risk assessment? It weights your HVRAs, is the term used, your highly valued resources and assets. It weights those on the landscape to show areas at greatest risk of wildfire. So when we ran our risk assessment, our inputs were fire behavior, so those are the metrics we just went over, your fire history, your natural resources, and cultural resources, the items we just looked at as well. And then critical infrastructure. So that's things like roadways and, fire departments, law enforcement offices, things like that. So basically, if there was to be a fire on the landscape, what areas would have the most values that would be threatened by that wildfire? So within things like natural and cultural resources, there was a sub-weighting. So for an example, that prime riparian habitat was marked as a higher value than, say, just an area with a bunch of invasive species in there. Okay, so we're going to pop back to this, and if you look at the risk assessment, again, same kind of coloring here. So red is going to be extreme, orange is high. As you can see, because of all the importance within that creek bed and most of that half-mile treatment influence zone, you see a lot of red and you see a lot of orange, and then you see some yellow. So a lot of values out on the landscape in this project area. This is the risk assessment. So a lot of folks, automatically think, oh, this is the fire behavior map. It's not. The fire behavior is just one input, and that's why it takes into account your other resource areas as well that are also important to consider. All right, so what does this mean for the project? Well, there's a lot of stuff out there that we care about, to put it simply. And so the management approach is going to be focused on fuels reduction, but that fuels reduction is multi-purpose. It's not only going to reduce future wildfire behavior, but it's also going to remove non-native invasive plant species. It's going to maintain and enhance that riparian and wildlife habitat, and it will discourage unauthorized trespassing when it gets cleaned up. So west of I-15, the fuels are predominantly grass and herbaceous with well-spaced shrubs. And then there's also those riparian areas, which I showed on the map. They look small, but they're more extensive when you're actually out there. And there's a bunch of invasive species present. So our proposed actions, mowing in your grass and herbaceous fuels, manual removal, so that could be by hand, that could be using chainsaws, that could be using things like weed whackers to remove invasive species. And then potentially manual thinning using things like chainsaws and loppers to limb the trees. And those are fuels that contribute to the latter fuels. East of I-15, you see a lot more of those latter fuels, which underneath the right conditions can lead to more extreme fire behavior and fire getting into the canopies. There's grass and shrubs, and then there's invasive species as well. So a similar approach, this one though is a little bit more focused on removal of invasive species, a lot of different species types over on that eastern portion. And then again, mowing your grass herbaceous areas and potentially that manual thinning of the tree limbs and your shrubs that are in that ladder fuel level. So the goal is reducing your grass height before it cures out. So just think, if you have grass that is hip high, your flame length is going to be approximately 1.5 to 2.5 times that length. So if you mow grass before it's completely cured out and available to burn in the summertime, you're gonna have a lot shorter flame lengths. Reducing invasive species, because one, we don't want them, but also they're contributing to that fuel load, especially again in that ladder fuel level. And then targeted reduction of other ladder fuels. And that is, a difficult one because you do want to keep that prime riparian habitat. So the approach here, even though it's through, fuels reduction work, it really is a holistic approach to all the different resources that we see out there on the landscape. All right, and then okay.
Anything about people, like keeping people out as your management approach? Because that's the number one source of fire.
We're not, I know TNC has been working on putting up some fencing, so that would definitely contribute to it. And, we've worked with Mark to get those documents and be in communication with them about that. But specifically, there would not be an action targeted towards that.
Why is that?
It would be a byproduct of what we're doing. Folks like to trespass in areas where there's a lot of cover and they think they're not seen. Well, one, if you help clean out some of that overgrown stuff, there's not so much cover. And two, if they do get in there and start a fire with the reduced fuel loading, if a fire were to start, it's not gonna have that same outcome as it would right now.
But it's a good idea, right?
Well, I think it's the most
I
important.
think, I think this plan should actually have that as part of the
Absolutely.
recommendation.
If people
Part
start
of,
fires,
either code enforcement or park rangers or, sheriff's department's responsibility. Management and monitoring, but in cooperation with, I think that was sort of the point originally was, you've got the Tonga's, TCI, you've got SDSU, you've got, a lot of, Caltrans infrastructure and other HOAs and everybody else, so it should be a coordinated, effort among all.
Well, I agree with that, but it should be part of the plan.
Yeah, that's how I was gonna wait as well.
Yeah, and so this would be underneath that resilient landscapes, like your fuels treatments, and something like that code enforcement is pretty common underneath items like your wildfire response or your community sector, because it's dealing with, like you're saying, collaborative work and enforcing codes and maybe coming up with a design that helps deter folks.
I think it's important because, the 23 years I've been here, trying to get so many people involved in working a comprehensive way of keeping people out, we've never had a way to do that. And I think that it's time for all the stakeholders to understand that. You guys yourself came up with the idea that humans are the number one source. And if we can keep the humans out and not starting fires, then we're a lot further along, I think.
Is there any estimate of how many people are camping there?
It's not just people that are unhoused, it's everybody.
Okay, and the last thing I just wanted to share today, like I said, this is one of the printed out maps. So this shows you those high level vegetation types, which I showed you earlier on the map. And then it also shows some of the conservation easements that are currently in place within the project area, so would require, coordination with the leading agency for those.
Question.
Yes.
This is an important wildlife corridor, and you're talking about living out trees and things, which is important for wildlife to use as cover. How would you find a balance between the host modification needs and accommodating that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's why that is a potential proposed action. I think it really does depend on the specialists working together to find that balance. So I know I've worked with our wetland scientists a lot because, from her lens, it's riparian area, which is critical. We don't want to do anything except for remove those invasive species. but from the wildfire lens, right, it's reducing wildfire behavior. So ultimately, especially with different easements in place, it may end up where there is no limbing of trees, and reducing the invasive species in that latter level is the only fuels reduction that we do for that. It's definitely complicated.
There's a big tension there, for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
I can chime in on that. Adrian, Sean, Caltrans, sorry to overlap with you. So when we are doing our fuel reduction, the right of way, and our fuel reduction has areas where we have a great area, where we have, let's say, vegetation that might correspond with certain types of species habitat, then we'll have to make a determination whether we can skip those areas or whether we can study the next study or whatnot. So it's getting in sequence. And so for the most part, we find that using skips is effective and our field still be able to provide its fire controls that we're seeking. The defensible space capacity while having minimal because of biologists on site to determination impact on those riparian areas and concerns.
So you say skip like literally, we're just gonna skip this area and skip this, okay, interesting.
So another good example might be, let's say that we have, this might not be the best example, but we release beetles in order to be able to control cameras. And it's effective like police partners. And so if there was cameras, that would be where you make the determination. Is the fire risk and consciously present more detrimental to the species than just leaving it out there, knowing that we have a beetle that's already impacted and that would kind of steer the decision that widespread say, hey, there's already controls that are being put in place, they're sustainable. If we remove vegetation not related to that species impact, we still are able to have increased defensible space. We don't have to necessarily clear everything in order to build more.
Yeah, the great thing about a project of this size is, you can be really targeted with your approach, as opposed to something that's tens of thousands of acres. It's really difficult because of, the time and the cost to get that done. So a lot of times too, the tree species out there need fire, and fire's been excluded so long that they're not healthy. I mean, oak is a prime example. So sometimes the limbing is just removing the dead limbs that are still in the tree, because when fire gets in those, that's where there's an issue, as opposed to removing the dead limbs, helping the tree, be healthier, and not having those, ready to burn fuels attached there. That is all I had, so open for questions. I did want to make clear, I've been working with Mark, because this is, not necessarily your traditional CWPP. Along with the CWPP, I mentioned there would be process appendices, and those are for each resource area, and really giving the city a full package of when you're ready to implement, these are the steps to take. So it would be permitting, it would be, agencies that may need to be coordinated and consulted with, especially for some of those critical resources out there like water and air quality.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Chair.
All right, well, you said your modification is gonna be your primary approach. Have you been coordinating with the HOAs that are adjacent to the stream?
We have not. That is one thing we were trying to get information on. We have not had a HOA member participate yet.
Every HOA we contacted was either a bad email or we got no response. So the listings we have, we didn't get any response.
But
We'll follow up on that.
yeah, that'd be great if anyone has a good contact.
So the risk modeling that you're showing kind of underestimates the risk, because and this is sort of for all modeling that's done today, because there is no urban interface fuel model. I know CAL FIRE and others are kind of trying to move in that direction, and NWCG is very resistant to changing the way they do things. But for California, there's a big push to include that as one of the fuel models. Absent that, go back to your one slide that shows the risk assessment, doesn't look bad, because it's mostly riparian vegetation and kind of a lower lower risk of burn, and spread. But those urban interface, the conflagrations that we get, that's where the real risk is today. And we're seeing that over and over again in communities. And it has to do not just because we're talking about fuel management within this zone of interest in Temecula Creek, but then there's that whole next layer within that buffer, that's the fuel management within the community as well. And then all of the other things that folks should be doing that fall under, their own defensible space and property management. So is that gonna get put into this plan at some point?
Well, couple questions, I guess, within that one question, but yes, absolutely agree. So the structure to structure ignition is something we're seeing more and more out west, California and Colorado and Oregon. There is no model. NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology, has been working on that. There have been a couple preliminary papers that have been released. The last one was in 2022, I think. And they actually used the campfire from up north as one of their experiment and study grounds to come up with the model. So currently there is no platform or modeling out there that looks at ignition or structure to structure ignition. And you're right, that is a huge gap in what we do because all of this looks just at wildland fuels and wildfire. It does not take into account once a fire gets into a community, what to do there. So I'm hoping something within the next year. I mean, they've been working on it since 2019 and we'll see where it goes.
But in the interim, is there something that can be done on this plan to identify that as a risk and
I mean,
work with those HOAs and property owners to make sure that they're doing their part?
I see what you're saying. So the only thing that we could do with something like that is manually increasing, the risk in that area and saying, in a written explanation, this is why we manually chose to change that because modeling does not account for it.
Yeah, and I don't know how good, the data, I think, some parts of those neighborhoods are a little bit better at managing their own ornamental vegetation than others. Others are just, trees overhanging rooftops and
Oh yeah.
that kind of thing. So it's, so it's not equal among all of that. But, as we start reaching out, I guess, to the HOAs, I think that's gonna be an important component of all this.
Yes. So this is where when we hopefully get the HOA involvement and general public, it's underneath the fire adapted communities section, like I was mentioning. The fuels treatments is underneath the fire resilient landscapes. And this is where, educating property owners on what they can do for defensible space is huge. It is crazy, if you guys are from California, you see up and down the state how many easy things a homeowner could do that still have not been done, like not having your wood stacked against the side of your house or, changing a wooden shingled roof to something that is not flammable. So there are a lot of measures and a lot of improvements, not just around here, but throughout the state that could be made for sure. And it does help with that defensible space within the 100 feet. But sometimes, we even saw in some examples, like in Greenville for the Dixie Fire, that there were lots of homes in town that had defensible space, but once, it's fully engulfed the structure next door, 100 feet unfortunately does not stop the type of fire behavior happening.
So one of the things that we didn't talk about originally when this was written up was the public health piece of this. But I can't remember if it was 2021 or 22, but there was some legislation passed that said all the counties have to start putting together programs for smoke exposure alert systems and public information and outreach and all that during either controlled burns or actual incidents. I just put that on your radar because it's gonna have to be done at some point in coordination with the county and state public health. So there should probably be a placeholder in the plan that kind of includes some language, along those lines. Riverside's farther behind than most counties in the state in doing this, so it's not gonna come, I don't know, maybe something happens in the next 6 months, but it's not gonna be timely for this thing, but there should be something that mentions that.
Yeah, definitely. UC Davis actually a couple years ago started a program for that. They had a lot of open surveys to the public, if you guys didn't see it, asking for input of people who have experienced wildfires and how it impacted their health. And there actually recently was federal announcements that there are studies and it's going to eventually, be incorporated into documents. But yeah, it does take a little while for sure to get that stuff moving even after legislation.
The only other thing I had was just the community training and CAL FIRE training program, what's going on with that?
Chief Crater's taken that up. I spoke to him a few weeks ago, I don't know if he was working on it, but the original one we had met with the fire folks, he said that wasn't exactly gonna work with what he wanted to do, so he was gonna take it on himself, and I'm not sure where he is in that process, but I would follow up.
Okay, is that gonna include like CERT and all those folks in that?
I would assume so.
Yeah. So I was just talking to Mike this morning about this, but there's a effort to do, so we're helping Marietta, and I need to reach out to you guys as well on this from a consulting standpoint, but to do a CWPP for Marietta as well. And hopefully, these plans will cross off with each other, I mean, that's the idea. But, there's been a discussion of sort of regional training programs for, fire agencies to get together, once a year, simulate an urban interface fire in some community, get everybody together, that sort of thing. And then create more of a regional perspective too on CWPPs that hopefully gets most of Southwest Riverside County and the cities and unincorporated area too. It's a little bit further down the line, but it's something that, and I was maybe talking to Aaron about this, but it's something that probably WRCOG would serve well as the umbrella for, since all the cities are already, the county are already part of that, there's no reason to sort of reinvent the wheel. But, as this plan starts rolling out next year, I think this would be a good platform to kind of help all the other communities understand. I think they all realize they need it, but they just don't know how to get it done.
Yeah, it's an undertaking for sure. Trying to get everybody involved and incorporate feedback. I agree, there's been a really big push lately, which is nice, to work across jurisdictions, but there's a lot of work that's needed. Marin County and the Truckee area, I'd say, are two areas in California that are ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the state. And they are, working on simultaneous documents that all feed into each other at once. It's a big undertaking, but it's pretty impressive.
So I just wanted to expand on that. You're preparing the community wildfire protection plan. It's being created through a grant that was funded and the city applied for. So I assume the city will adopt this plan or will go to the city council and it'll get adopted. It'll have recommendations for fuel reduction. And permits will be required to do that. So we'll have a plan. And then there's a need for permits. Is there a step in between there that is there a CEQA component or a CEQA requirement prior to permits?
So they basically go hand in hand. And when we have those process appendices to share with you guys, where I had that, I just had that in the timeline. So the process appendices, we will have one for fuels treatments. One of our recommended approaches for CEQA is CalVTP, and that is a programmatic EIR through CAL FIRE or through the Board of Forestry, not CAL FIRE specifically, that helps streamline and make CEQA for fuels work more efficient. And then within like the natural resource appendice, we have some of those checklists and forms and permits that would be needed if you're going to do work and say, riparian habitat or protected habitat, et cetera. So it would basically be an outline for the city for when you have funding and people and are ready to implement of what needs to be done for implementation. But yes, correct, CEQA is a part of that.
All right, so we need a plan adopted,
Yes.
and then there's a CEQA process associated with that, there's
Yes.
money associated with that, and then there's funding the permits. And with the different ownership in that area, you've got Rancho California, you've got flood control, you've got Caltrans, you've got potentially Pachanga. I think Fish and Wildlife has some property down there. RCA, BL.
Yep. Definitely.
Do all of those agencies or jurisdictions sign on to one permit? Or do they each get an individual permit for their properties? I'm just wondering how we translate this into action. We actually finally get down there and do some fuel reduction, assuming everyone can agree on what needs to be done.
It depends on who actually owns the land, whose jurisdiction it falls underneath. So if you are staying, I mean, this is a simplified version of land ownership, but you can see, if you can read it, that most of the other jurisdictions are in that far southwestern portion. So it's actually kind of great because most of it falls within the city, which makes it easier. You know, obviously coordination, collaboration with your neighbors and partners is fantastic, but in theory, it is up to the city because it's on your land.
This is Riverside County flood too, then. It's flood control, yeah.
Yeah, something like that's probably not on here. This is just like the land ownership agencies.
So you need to get everybody's buy-in on it.
Yeah.
Is that the goal then, is to get like one master agreement or something in place?
I'm kind of just throwing it out there right now, I'm thinking about how do we do this?
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of data, we know what kind of fuels are there. The Nature Conservancy, everyone's working on this, there's fencing plans, there's all kinds of interest in this area. But I'm just kind of thinking through, we might have a fire before we ever get to any permits.
Yeah.
So,
Let's,
yeah, yeah, I agree.
so, it's,
So I bring that up, there is a process here to get to where we actually
There
can reduce the fuel.
There is, and so again, like that's why I remind people, a CWPP is great because it gets everybody involved, but it is not mandating anything, and that's why the next step is getting permits, getting CEQA, and then you can implement. But it brings people to the table, lets them know what you want to do, it gets their input ahead of time, so then hopefully when it comes to implementation, it's a lot easier. Yeah, it's, like I said, not an easy undertaking.
For me, a layman, if I'm thinking about risk here, I'm thinking about the homes on the east side, but then also the freeway itself. Given what we just saw in the news, the 10 freeway up in LA, I don't know, it looks like there's a lot of fuel underneath the 15.
I'd have to go back and refresh on the pictures, but I think there was quite a bit, yeah.
How's that fire start?
they're saying it was arson.
So Matt, Team RCD manages a lot of the flood control facilities in our region. And we have a permit that allows us to remove invasives and non-natives. And so this could be a possibility going forward if you could contract with us we contract with SAWA to do that work. But in terms of how all the pieces fit together, I don't know, but that might be a path forward.
If possible, if that's something we could think about in the creation of this plan, is that coordination and really laying out the next steps with CEQA and then, I guess, a permitting, or maybe recommendations for the permitting process. Because there's a lot of jurisdictions that bring together here to make it happen.
Yes, so that is what will be in those appendices of the CWPP, because that's not traditional in the CWPP, so it's like an add-on to help give that full package to the city, so you guys are ready to go.
So then hopefully all the agencies can sign off on one master agreement and then
Yes.
have some sort of roles and responsibilities. Because what I hate to see happen is, you know, there's a need to do some fuel clearing or something and then, you know, an HOA says, no, you can't enter our property, or, you know, Caltrans says, no, now's not the right time, or Fish and Wildlife says, you know, there's, you know, bird issues or whatever, and it's like, you know, and then we're back where exactly where we were, you know, 2 years ago, we started talking about this, and
Definitely.
nothing gets done.
Definitely. So there will be, and like you mentioned, yes, this plan goes to the city for approval, city board, but then also, you know, there's a signatory page. So everybody on the development team is supposed to agree to it and sign off on it.
There's Does one of your process appendices include the community outreach and education plan?
So that'll be when we come back for another meeting. That's part of the recommendation matrices that we'll do. So we'll basically have folks sit down and talk about, not for the fuels treatments, because that's the part that is pretty much done here, but for the communities portion, talking about what measures can be done in HOAs and even communities outside HOAs where they can increase defensible space, help improve ingress, egress, et cetera, that kind of stuff. Does that answer the question? Sort of.
I think we'll get more as we go on.
The fuel mod, you were talking about chainsaws, weed whackers, and everything else. I think early on in the process, the idea of sheep or goats was brought up. Will that be an option?
If you, again, it depends
I don't know
on.
if that's a good idea or not.
So we had started with that and even prescribed fire, and then just on our interdisciplinary team with the different specialists, wildlife specialists, botanists, and the wetlands scientists, we took out prescribed fire and prescribed herbivory, because prescribed herbivory gets complicated with all of the threatened and endangered species that are actually there in the community. And then prescribed fire is difficult because of the WUI right next door. But I mean, if you guys think that working with collaborators that there would be buy-off on both of those are obviously measures that can be mentioned in the document as potential avenues.
Maybe the initial, I'm just thinking, with all the vegetation down there, the initial might have to be more, not using sheeps, it would be pretty controlled, but then once it's controlled, then after that, the opportunity might be there. Because there will be maintenance.
Of course, yeah. I know this is just, in fire we'll call it like initial entry, and then of course there's ongoing maintenance. So yeah, just talking with our biologists and like I said, the wetland scientists, they love prescribed herbivory as well. I love it, it's very effective, but you cannot target. They're going to eat, whatever is out there. So it's really great for things like poison oak, cheatgrass, because usually that's the only thing out there, so they get rid of it. But in a riparian habitat, it's definitely more complicated to use them.
I wouldn't exclude prescribed fire either. Australia's doing a lot of interesting stuff with prescribed fires and urban interface now. And using different technologies to sort of keep it as a very low level. It's fascinating what they've been doing. And they use these like leaf blowers too to like direct the fires. And you wouldn't think this worked, but man, it was phenomenal success in really short areas, next to urban, interface and sensitive resources and all that. And they, it was amazing outcomes. So, I'm not saying we get everybody out there with leaf blowers just yet in the match, but there's emerging, solutions to this that I think are, so I wouldn't want to foreclose on it and keep it off the plan and then have to amend the plan later.
Okay, yeah, we could definitely add that, especially as a maintenance treatment. Once things are in a little better condition, it's definitely, I'm a huge prescribed fire proponent, so that'd be,
You
is
can
good.
talk about the options and the preferred, and then why you're not recommending the others, but consider.
Did I hear that some fire captain up in Pacific Northwest got charged for a prescribed burn that actually got out of control? Did it have
So there's
qualified immunity?
they now have, that's the big challenge in federal fires mostly, but state California's following that same, is the individual can now face personal liability as a person who runs the burn. Yeah. It used to be, complete immunity for government actions, and that is no longer the case. But, those court cases, they're kind of weird because they're not necessarily binding the way they were written. But yeah, that's why a lot of people don't want to control burns, they don't want to manage them themselves. But it's still a huge tool in California.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, it's really scary.
Definitely. And it'd be great to see more support. So if you guys think locally that there is, that's fantastic. And it differs across the country. Back in the Southeast, it's so common. You drive down a road and people are yard burning on a Sunday. No one bats an eye. So Yes.
I'm kind of wondering what you're envisioning as the end result.
End result of
Clean out
the,
the weeds, are we replacing them with anything, are they gonna put grass, or is it just let weeds grow back?
that is not my expertise. I have to defer to someone else on that. From the fuel standpoint, it's ongoing maintenance to make sure the invasives and those ladder fuels don't continue to come back. When you're doing things like mowing grass, you're not removing it. It's just like cutting your grass in your backyard. So it's just reducing the height. But it'll still put out seed every year.
I do think that's where the coordination with the Nature Conservancy comes in, because they have a vegetation plan
That's right.
that they're working on, so perhaps the CWPP could reference what the Nature Conservancy is working on.
They gave you all the surveys, didn't they?
Yes, we are referencing like all their surveys that they've already conducted. It's only for that one portion of the project, however, so unfortunately we don't have it for the entire project footprint.
What would be your agency's end result?
Me?
Your agency?
My agency's SDSU, that's the question.
How would you prefer it to look at the end after we've done all the work?
That's not my call. BLM, it's Office of Wildlife, it's Chamba.
Right, we haven't.
I guess that's the point of the plan though, right, is to kind of get all these parties together to say, you know, what is the outcome? Because, you know, number one outcome, the umbrella for this was fuel reduction and reducing fire risk, right? So there's gonna be less vegetation on the ground, but then I think to your point, it's, you know, Nature Conservancy and everybody else, even SDSU, you're gonna wanna see, you know, invasive species removal, because that's the start of the, you know, Santa Margarita River, right? So anything you can do to manage that, and so does that mean, you know, at some point, there's, you know, a plan to do some, you know, native habitat restoration and, you know, see if it's like, right, yeah.
He's asking a very good question.
Right now, Rancho Water's kind of doing the same thing, we're
Yeah.
looking at our spillway for the dam. And we've got all these trees that we've allowed to grow, and we wanna knock them out because if we ever have 10 feet of water, we don't want these trees slowing down the water and then it's overtopping the dam.
Yeah.
So right now, we're kind of doing the same thing, and we're thinking, we want them out. I prefer to put cement on that land, but it's not gonna be, probably not gonna be allowed, and so we're going for an intermediate, we just want to put grass.
Yeah, we have an existing condition, but if we had a blank slate, what would it look like? What would the ideal vegetation, fencing, and everything else look like?
Well, maybe this is, probably gotta get back to that, but, you know, that bridge is a fire risk, right?
That's what you say.
Alright, well, let's just call it that. I mean,
Well, then we
but-
can't call it that, it's
sure,
what you
sure.
say,
No,
so.
no, but I mean, but here's an opportunity to say, you know, there's other things in this, you know, in this project footprint that matter, right? And so that bridge is leading up, you know, it's changing, erosion, sedimentation, and, you know, and that leads to fuel buildup. It's probably a bad example, but,
Well, then
you know,
I use it.
well, because it could be on the list of, you know, the more you talk about, you know, within this project area, here's all the stuff, the infrastructure that matters, you know, then maybe at some point there's a grant that gets written or something and somebody says, yeah, you know what, you're right, our, you know, TNC's plan for, you know, managing, you know, riparian corridors being impacted by something downstream, which impacts the fire management plan, you know, I'm just saying, you know, there may be opportunities to integrate some other stuff in here to kind of get some traction. I mean, I don't know why that's always been so hard to get done, but, you know, but I you know, whatever switch gets flipped, maybe there's something there that can help.
I'd like to see us start the conversation on the signatory page sooner rather than later. I can get these people, these different agencies to the meetings, and then, because we'll want that when the city goes through about this, make sure everyone
We should be
owns
more-
property.
They should be part of that process
Yeah.
up front.
I know they're
After-
invited.
and not afterwards.
Yeah.
Because then it's, well, I didn't agree to this.
Especially the HOAs.
Okay, so I've updated that one.
They were invited, they just don't show.
They're not setting necessarily, but sometimes these things aren't really communicated. I do have a service contract for post mile 0, 2, 6, 4, or do you do original through that So like ground binning, obviously seed will be done.
Where is this?
This is from post house 0, 6.4 and 15. So I believe this should be within the limits of my service contract. And so you will see some work that is done by Caltrans in that area. And then, of course, like we're talking about the maintenance aspect. Caltrans is not here for fuels management. Obviously, that's one of the things that as long as I've been in fire, we've always done it. And I've had jobs where, we take down to dirt all of the schools in San Francisco 10 feet from the fence lines, for instance, because they're not allowed to use herbicides. Where, the requirement is to mulch all the grass in 4-inch pieces. I've had fire state councils where we've had the grant funding in order to install shaded field breaks like on the coast and like San Francisco Bay Area, and it always comes back up. When is the correct interval to get back in to maintain a shaded field break? Are you gonna go back in and maintain the clear cut understory that you did in 3 years or 6 years? Or perhaps, that's something where Fish and Wildlife will say that we want 50% of native vegetation left in place. And so you're kind of sometimes guided by, funding the areas out at the requirements of the cities.
Yeah, I know you had asked if there's any homework, thank you, ahead of time, but, that the open access easement, conservation easement database is probably not the end all be all, so nothing from Caltrans showed up within the project footprint, but that's not saying that there isn't, like, you think that there might be in place, so when you're collaborating partners right there. But yes, I agree, the question of when you remove invasives, do you replant native vegetation, is it needed? That's, where other specialists come into play of what their expert opinion is. Do you need to replant to keep that riparian habitat or that critical wildlife corridor? From a fuel standpoint, I say don't replant, but that's because that's my specialty.
And in answer to your question, what would it look like? From my perspective, I think fuels modification is obviously really important. And in the community I manage fuel modification myself, there's 400 acres. But what I worry about much more than the fuels modification, which is done very well, is the trespass and the surrounding homes that have the trees draping over their house. So I think there needs to be, we need to keep people out of the creek. And we really need to have a lot of public education. Maybe there's like a little bit of a stick as well as a carrot in there. Because I was a little disturbed to see on your map, like the whole gray swath, which is like, this is not burnable. But it is, and ignitions can start within communities too. So it's at least a 3-pronged approach, not just one application.
Yeah, agreed. Like I said, this looks at wildland fuels and wildland fire,
Right.
and that's where, there's still that disconnect with human community fires.
And something where this is very tangential, but you said like replacing roofs. Is there any incentives for people to place roofs? Because roofs are super expensive, like $30,000 to change your roof and just get by. And these are good things that would happen. Does the state or the feds, they offer anything, or insurance companies?
So CAL FIRE just started a couple new rebate programs, but it's usually at the local level. So that was actually the example, I forgot to explain this, so my apologies. When you looked at this one right here, Measure T initiatives is actually what the town of Truckee has been doing, where they are taking a newly created tax to put directly towards reimbursing property owners for defensible space measures. So it's replacing vents that have no screens or large openings with ones with 1/8 inch or smaller openings to prevent embers from getting in. It's things like a green waste program where if you remove vegetation in your yard, they come pick it up and basically mulch it for free. So there are a couple other counties that also have instituted these tax measures that go directly to these programs, but it's difficult. Solano County tried to pass one a couple years in a row and it failed. They did not get enough. So it again goes back to community education and awareness, because if the community doesn't see the importance of it, then they're not going to vote for that measure. But that definitely seems to be the most effective. When you rely on grants, it's a constant job of someone, as a full-time duty, right? Someone looking for grants, applying for grants, allocating that grant money, and it's a never-ending cycle.
How did that trucking program work? How long has it been going on? You know?
The measure passed officially, I think, last year, so the first year of funding is this year. But, just from that small population, it is, a lot of money for these measures. It's pretty amazing. So part of that has also gone towards the fire department creating home inspections. And so on a 3-year cycle, they are inspecting every single home and getting really detailed data about what, defensible space violations are on a parcel versus what's in compliance.
City council will pass it next week.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again not an easy, it's a cool thing.
There's other
but-
programs out there that have been talked about that are similar to is that Energy Star, right? Where you can get rebates for like a fridge and that kind of thing, or tax breaks on your, taxes. There's a lot of discussion around similar programs. It's just trying to get consensus around that is really tough. But, like replacing windows on a home or the box beams or, vents or whatever, rooftops, those are all, if you can write them off somehow as a tax or a benefit, or if you can get some sort of rebate or whatever. There's a lot of discussion around it. It's just, so we had worked with the state on a similar program, and the pretend budget we had to work with was roughly $100 million. And if you look at the 5.1 million homes in California that are actually in this high-risk area, annually, it would only serve about 10,000 homes. And so you were like, well, it sounds really great, but this program wouldn't roll through all those high-risk homes for 50 years. I mean, it's not something that you need to ignore, but it's also like, this doesn't solve today's problem, right? And so there has to be some mechanism. I love the idea, and the city could actually, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a placeholder in the CWPP that talks about it.
A clearinghouse for what is available now
Right.
in trucking programs.
Yeah, and maybe look at those kind of programs because they're important, they can be huge. And especially for the homeowner who, if code enforcement goes in and says, man, you've gotta cut down or limb up, all of your trees, and the homeowner's like, I don't have $5,000 to spend on this, what do? Does the city just go in and tag the house? Or do we, does the city put together a program that helps the homeowner out? The second one's a lot better, in my opinion, so,
Forever.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is where, really educating HOAs on a Firewise community can come into play, because then you have the buy-in, you have that certification, you're more likely to have these local programs in place. So yeah, hopefully we get some HOA reps.
Fire State Council here. I know there's one in Wine Country, and I know there's been one skirting around in La Cresta.
There is one up in La Cresta, and there is one in Wine Country.
They don't do anything. But you never hear about them, right? Other like Vista and others, they're so engaged. Their fuel programs, they've got the chippers.
Yep.
They have all these resources and stuff. And ours don't. Nobody knows about them. I've asked a couple of times over the last year what's going on, and nobody knows even who's on the boards.
Maybe this process of reaching out to the HOAs and we have a meeting in the field could kickstart.
Just create your own down here, because that's, the city, once you get your CWPP in place, you can start going after all sorts of fuel reduction grants and all sorts of cool stuff, which is great. But a fire safe council could be doing the same thing as a nonprofit in your community to, go after more, grassroots level kind of stuff. But we just don't have anything like that.
I heard you can't have a fire safe community or council in the city.
No, not true.
Okay.
Not true. Yeah, lots of them have them. It's just, they've never really organized here for some reason.
Question, do you think the lack of engagement is because people don't think it's a priority, or do you think it's not enough education?
On which side?
Lack of input from community, like HOAs or not having a fire safe council, or maybe an RCD is not looking at Temecula.
Well, from an emergency management standpoint, with the things that I've done in the last almost 3 years with the rewrite of our hazard mitigation plan and trying to engage the community and having multiple public meetings, they don't come. Because the answer that I get, it's not gonna happen here.
Really?
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why you don't see a lot more participation in that way. Or support, because it's not gonna happen here.
Except when there's smoke in the air, then everybody starts
Oh,
calling,
yeah,
right?
all the community talk groups go wild when that happens.
What does the city do? Yeah.
But, I think if we can leverage the Fairview fire, now recently the Highland fire, they had evacuation zones up to the edge of the city limits. It's only a matter of time. And when you look at the fuel that's around us that hasn't burned in over 2 decades, it's really a matter of time. And it's gonna happen.
I agree, I think we've been kind of trained to rely on the big strong firemen to come rescue us. And there's been not enough emphasis on personal responsibility.
Exactly, big strong firemen are gonna come protect us, but Mother Nature's gonna take over.
Yeah,
And she's gonna blow it and drive it by wind and everything, there's nothing they can do to control that.
Well,
That's the problem.
You know,
All
we're
of
just
our
in-
disasters are more expensive, more costly, more devastating, and more frequent.
the lessons learned on some of the big conflagrations were, sadly, you're not gonna stop those fires. There's nothing they can do to stop those fires, except what they did like in Fort McMurray and others. They just bulldozed homes down and created a destruction of, properties to create a fire line. That's how they stop those fires, and so it's, there's
How
nothing.
big is that with the fire, the swing driven? I mean, what do you say, how big is that fire line you cut?
Yeah, you need it because it's so that's the one thing that's not in the modeling, which, should be at some point are the firebrands and embers. Because the firebrands and embers, can travel a mile away from source. And, we could get a fire down here that starts something in the center of the city on fire. And that's how these conflagrations are happening now.
And
Because you're totally not prepared in the middle and everybody's focused over here. Outside the firebrands and embers, it's the radiant heat, and the amount of heat coming off of these things. A 100-foot buffer, like you said, that doesn't stop anything. That'll catch the next house on fire, without any direct flame impingement. So you're talking about, a swath of, half a highway that you need to be able to stop those massive.
Well, that's miles.
Yeah,
From
and then
here
you're,
to
it's.
to Home Depot.
It's a serious consideration. They are very difficult. That's why you need the red carpet from the DC-10s that get dropped and everything else, because it's, they're realizing there's not a lot you can do to stop these things from happening. So that's good news. Although, I'll say, there's one home in Maui that stands out from all the rest because of their construction and the materials. And everything around it was burned down but that one home. And so everybody's, yeah, absolutely. Concrete, stucco, no box eaves, vents, a more modern home design, and this one home among everything stands out as being completely untouched.
What's the cost per square foot compared to?
That's the trick, right? So you're talking about, substantially changing the building codes or something, and, that's not something with homes built in the 80s, 90s and things. It's what you were saying earlier, how do you get the incentives to get homeowners to update even, double pane windows? That's a huge benefit to homes, but who's gonna pay for it?
Can you pull up the map of the animals?
Oh, sorry, which one?
The ones that show the animals, the wildlife? Yeah, wildlife.
Yeah, so
What do those signify, the diamonds?
these are points like right here, this is where they verified a call from Elise Belsverio. So just marking, critical habitat.
Is there a legend?
Just right up here. So when you click on the point, it brings up this information for it, that geospatial data. So you'd have to click on each one. Go right here.
What's the white one?
So they took a picture to document the habitat. The white one, let me see here. Toad. So like I mentioned before, these weren't species specific, these were just high level baseline surveys, so, but obviously biologists know that leaf spells vireo call, so they knew that's what it was.
So what's the blue one?
This one over here,
Yeah.
Cooper's hawk.
That's where his land is.
I'm sorry?
I was gonna ask him where his mountain lion is.
Any other questions?
We're good, thank you.
Thank you guys, appreciate it. Good discussion.
Expect an email probably after the holidays, letting us know for spring, and that's when we'll actually present our management approach, and we'll get comments on that, and then some more information to actually get your reaction and feedback from to amend the documents. So,
I did have one other question. Okay. This is covering up to about First Street. Although it looks like.
Do you want me to zoom in?
The total area is up to about First Street.
Oh, you mean with that half-mile buffer?
Yeah. What about,
We're just, I mean, we're just looking at that treatment influence zone, which for the size